Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Yasmin from SGL Friends of Palestine Society. I would like to welcome you to today's live discussion as part of Israeli Apartheid Week 2021, titled Is Israel Really an Apartheid State? So I'd like to first just thank you all for tuning in. I would also like to thank our collaborations, Friends of Al-Aqsa, as well as Association of Student Activism for Palestine, and the Nottingham, Plymouth and Queen Mary University Friends of Palestine Societies for working with us on this event. And of course, a big thank you to our guest speakers joining us today for the discussion. So I'd just like to introduce them all first. We have Issa Amro with us, a prominent human rights defender. Issa is the founder of Youth Against Settlements, a group of human rights defenders that strengthens the local community steadfastness against the expansion of illegal settlements and documents human rights violations. We also have with us Jeff Halper, who is an Israeli anthropologist and former head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Jeff served as the director of the Middle East Center for Friends World College, an international college which he eventually headed, and has taught at universities in Israel, the US, Latin America, and Africa, in addition to his many academic and political writings. We also have with us Dr. Ismail Patel, who is the chair of Friends of Al-Aqsa and an author of many writings, including Palestine Beginner's Guide. So the event today will be done as a discussion between our three speakers, which will be kindly led and facilitated by Dr. Ismail Patel. So that's all from me. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. I'd like to pass on to Ismail now. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Yasmin. That was greatly appreciated for the introduction. And I'm also honored to have Jeff and Issa. If I can request both of you to unmute your mic. So once we start discussion, hopefully we can carry on. So Jeff and Issa, if you can unmute your mics, please. The discussion really is very, very important. As we all know, this is Israeli Apartheid Week. But the question arises, and of course, there's a counter narrative that Israel is far from apartheid. It's a democratic country. Apartheid is something that happened to South Africa, and it's something to do with race between black and white people. So how can Israel be an apartheid state? I hope in the next 40 minutes to an hour that I have with my guest, we'll be able to unfold some of the issues regarding apartheid and how to understand Israel, whether it's a settler colonial state, whether it's a rightful, it has a legitimacy in the region to rule over another people. And this and other issues hopefully shall unfold as we go along. So I would like to open up with you, Jeff, in particular. How can Israel be an apartheid state, Jeff, when it is something that historically has been related to South Africa and it's to do with races?
Well, we have to understand that apartheid is a political project. It isn't unique to one particular place. It became known through South Africa. Apartheid is a Afrikaans word for separation. But you have apartheid. There's an international law covenant against the crime of apartheid. So it's recognized as an international situation. Myanmar, actually, with its Muslim population, has been the last country to be accused of an apartheid situation. And Israel is as well, and you can name a few other countries too. And basically, apartheid isn't an ideology. Apartheid is a structure. And it basically it happens when one dominant population establishes a regime of control and domination over other populations. And the formal definition of apartheid has to do with legality. And that's why, it's so appropriate to Israel, because it means that there are separate legal systems for populations based on their race, ethnicity, religion. It isn't only race, like blacks and whites. That's what it was in South Africa. That's certainly not the case in Myanmar, and it's not the case here. Here, in Myanmar, it's more of a religious issue. Here, it's a religious, ethnic, and national issue. But basically, what you have here in Israel is a legal system in which Israeli Jews have, it's a democracy if you're Jewish, Israel. and we have equal rights, and we have the right to vote and protest and all the protections of the courts and civil liberties. But if you're a Palestinian, now if you're a Palestinian in the occupied territory, which is half the population, you have none of those rights. You don't have access to Israeli courts. You don't have civil rights. You don't have citizenship. You don't have the right to land. Basically, you're disenfranchised. And the Palestinian citizens of Israel are kind of in the middle. You know, they have certain rights that Israel gives them, like voting. But, you know, a couple of years ago, Israel passed what's called the Jewish Nationalities Law that said this is a Jewish country, and to be Israeli, you really have to be Jewish. And the official language is Hebrew, not Arabic. And if the courts, and this is especially important, you know, if the courts find a conflict between human rights on one side and Jewish values on the other side, like, for example, settling the land or taking the land or whatever, Jewish values prevail in Israeli courts over human rights. So that really describes what an apartheid situation is. And we have that here in Israel, where Israeli Jews enjoy full civil rights, whereas Palestinian Arabs are, by definition, second-class citizens that are either completely disenfranchised or largely disenfranchised.
Thank you, Jeff. I just want to bring in Issa here. Before we advance any further, Issa, there could be an argument to say that, yes, we accept that potentially there's one racial group has a supremacy over another racial group. But look at Israel. I mean, you've got Knesset members who are Arabs. So how can Israel be an apartheid state? How would you answer that?
I answer, that by using myself as an example. I am now 40 years old. I am living under the Israeli occupation without any political or civilian human rights. I don't exist. I'm stateless. I don't have my identity as a Palestinian. They took it away from me. And the Palestinians who are living in West Bank and Gaza Strip and Jerusalem, they sort them as a different type of people without any right even to vote in the Israeli Knesset or Israeli parliament. This is one hand. On the other hand, even the few Palestinians who have the right to vote in the Israeli parliament, they don't have equal rights as the white Jews, as Jeff described. They have around 35 different laws, gives more rights to the white Jews over the Palestinians. So I'm living in Hebron city. The settlers who are living very close to my house, few meters from my house, they vote in the Israeli Knesset. They are living under the Israeli civilian law with full political and civilian human rights. Even they live in a welfare life on the expense of my basic human rights. On the other hand, I live in the same area. I live under the Israeli military law. Under the Israeli military law, I am not allowed to practice any kind of general assembly. I am guilty by the military law until I am proven innocent. So I need to find evidence to prove that I am innocent. Not only that, I'm not allowed to have any kind of free speech. I was arrested for writing online to tell my people to not give up their rights for the occupation. I can say that we are not allowed to use any kind of peaceful, non-violent resistance. I was arrested, tortured, intimidated, convicted in the military court for using non-violent resistance and peaceful disobedience against the Israeli occupation. So Israel is not really giving anyone, equality to be able to, to say that it's a democracy. And even the Palestinians who are inside 48 who votes for the Israeli Knesset or the Israeli parliament, they don't have the same infrastructure the Jews have to have their own democracy. Israel have democracy only for the Jews, unfortunately. Muslims, Christians, anybody else is not equal in Israel as they describe in the international community. Not only that, Israel is an occupation. they are occupying Palestinian land. They take our land and they give it to the settlers for free. They take our water resources and they give it to the settlers. So it can't be a democracy and a country where you have two sets of law for different people in the same area.
Okay, thanks for that, Issa. I think what's very important for everybody to understand that Israel operates under 4 different legal jurisdictions, or it operates by using 4 different laws. So you have different types of laws for pre-1967 area. Then you have the West Bank. People in West Bank are treated differently. Third, Gaza, people are treated differently. And then you have East Jerusalem. How they're treated in these 4 areas, what is common amongst them? Of course, each one has its own specific ways how they're treated, but what is common across them is in all these 4 jurisdictions, the status of the Jewish individual is higher than the Palestinian. And I think that's a common thread that ties them across. Jeff, I would like you to bring Jeff in here and to emphasize, to bring in the idea of the colonial settler state. Issa has mentioned about colonization. How do you see, Jeff, the colonization of the Palestinians under Palestinian territory?
Well, I think what's important to emphasize is that apartheid as a system doesn't just pop up. It isn't that one day people decide let's have an apartheid system, but it comes out of a logic, a wider political logic. And so unless you change the system, you're not going to get rid of the apartheid system itself. And you can look at the Israeli regime. First of all, if you ask the question that you asked before, what about Israel itself? Is that, if Palestinians in Israel have the vote, is it apartheid? There is no such thing as Israel itself. Israel is a regime, is a country with a legal system and a military system and so on, that rules from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River. So that you can't differentiate between Israel within the 67 borders and the occupied territories from the point of view of a legal system, of a military system, of a political system, even in a way a social and land, there's one infrastructure as well, one economy. We're already talking about one de facto state that really exists in the entire country. And that's why even if pieces of the country are a little bit different in terms of a little more rights for Palestinians or less rights for Palestinians, overall, the entire country has to be seen as one whole with an apartheid regime. And it's a hybrid regime because on the one hand, you've got occupation. And occupation has been at the center of a lot of our political work. But we have to remember that occupation is only over 22% of Palestine. Beyond occupation, again, you've got the entire country that's an apartheid regime, as we've described it, in terms of legally differentiating between 2 different populations. But that comes out of something even bigger. And that is the idea of settler colonialism. Zionism. And that's where it's similar to South Africa. It's similar to the US, to Canada, to Australia, to Algeria under the French. And that is that Zionism was a settler colonial movement. The Zionists came to this country and they were very upfront about it in order to take it over. They didn't come just to settle in the country like immigrants. They came as colonists to Judaize the country. That's a term we use. In order to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, Palestine into the land of Israel, and the entire country. So from the very beginning, the logic of Zionism, that's the point I'm trying to say, and the apartheid is simply an outcome of the logic. The logic of Zionism is, this is a country that belongs to the Jews exclusively. The indigenous Arab population, we don't even use the word Palestinian, has no rights here. It has no national existence. And they can just be displaced, thrown out, eliminated, whatever we have to do. But it's our story. It's our country, and we want to take it over. And that's the political logic that until today then gave rise to apartheid. Apartheid is the instrument of how you dominate and control another population. But the logic behind it is a settler colonial logic, and that means the only way out is not through negotiations, not through conflict management like we've been trying to do for years, and a two-state idea that Israel never entertained even. It's to decolonize the country, to say this is one country and we have to have a new, completely new political community here, a new polity here of equal rights between everyone that lives in the country, with, of course, the return of refugees. So I'm very involved in what's called the One Democratic State campaign. And we're trying to develop a political program because we're saying beyond protest, beyond discussions of apartheid and analysis and so on, we have to come to the political arena with a political program. And so I just have a new book out. I'm putting it in the chat line that deals with settler colonialism and the whole project of decolonization. But that's where apartheid comes out of it. Apartheid is part of a bigger context.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I just want to differentiate between settler colonialism and colonialism itself. And I think it's very important because that also helps us on the counter narrative or the decolonization aspect that Jeff has spoken about. Colonialism, classical colonialism, is a mother country going across around the world, occupying a territory, expropriating their wealth, their goods, subjugating the indigenous people, but forever thinking that that is a temporary hold for them until they can hold that region. And you have the end of colonialism mainly in the 40s and 50s. You have emergence of India, Pakistan, most of Africa, American states, where there's direct colonialism ended. Settler colonialism, as Jeff very well alluded to, is an idea of a different group of people, mostly emerging from Europe, settling down and trying to make that into their homeland. And in that process, the logic, as the word Jeff has used, the logic is to get rid of the indigenous people and gain as much land as possible. So the counter narrative to that, therefore, is to undermine colonialism, direct colonialism, is to expel them. And this is what happened throughout Africa and Asia and South America. But for settler colonialism, to decolonize that idea, we have to think something beyond. And one of the things we are going to talk about, hopefully later on, is this idea of one nation movement. But before we get there, I would like to bring in Issa and explain to us how we can see the right of movement, in particularly in West Bank, which you're part of, El Khalil, how that is impacting on your right to move and the right to build whatever you want within the region that you live in. Issa, if you can like to sort of explain to us on the ground what life is like living in the West Bank.
Life in West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem is really can't be described as a normal life. We live under the Israeli occupation, under the Israeli settlement project. So everything around us is restricted. To travel from Hebron to Bethlehem, I have to pass a checkpoint. To travel from Bethlehem to Ramallah, to Jenin, to Nablus, even to within West Bank, we have around 99 different checkpoints. 49 of them are border checkpoints, but the rest are in West Bank. In my city, Hebron, we have 22 checkpoints in 1 kilometer square. So to move from this neighborhood to another neighborhood in Hebron, you sometimes pass 2 to 3 checkpoints. What is a checkpoint? Checkpoint, it's a moody, sometimes racist, aggressive Israeli soldier trying to make your life harder and harder. So they force you or provoke you not to stay in your country, in Palestine or that area. All over West Bank, we have around 367, we call it movement barriers, closing this road, putting, blocks here, bulldozing the road there or there. So we have many, we call it movement barriers. In my city, Hebron, we have more than 100 movement barriers, which is really restricting the movement, of the Palestinians who are living inside my city, Hebron. Why are all that checkpoints? It's not about security for sure. It's about a fragmentation of the West Bank and not to have any demographical continuity between each city, each neighborhood, each village, any compound in Palestine, to easy control the Palestinians and to keep us isolated from our land or the targeted area which the Israeli settlers are trying to take it over. So the West Bank is fragmented by the checkpoints, by the movement barriers, and by the Israeli settlements and the Israeli military bases all over West Bank. And by time they are working to divide it more, separate it more. So we say we are segregated and unequal in our own cities, villages, and compounds, and we are reaching the point to live in ghettos. What ghettos, Mr. Ismail? Each city, each compound has, we call them yellow gates. A gate, yellow, it's yellow. If you go all over West Bank, you see the yellow gates at the entrances. They close them whenever they want, and they open them whenever they want. Who are they who open and close? It's the Israeli military, and they do it only for control, for punishment, for any kind of training. We are training object for them, and we are even an election object. They give our land as a gift for the Israeli settlers, Israeli leaders. You don't tell them that we promise you to make development in Tel Aviv. No, they tell them, okay, we develop the settlements in Hebron. We take the Palestinian land and give it to you. So this is what they do. I want, because there are students who are mainly who are watching us now and listening to us, I like that the students read a position paper was published by Patel, the Israeli Human Rights Center, and it described that Israel is an apartheid state from the river to the sea. I know that Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are working on a research about if Israel is an apartheid or not. Something else, Ismail, I am not allowed to travel to Jerusalem. I need a permit to go to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and because I'm a human rights defender, I'm not allowed to visit Al-Aqsa Mosque, where I only go to pray. I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed to visit Jeff, where he lives now legally, according to the Israeli law, because I need a permit from the occupation, because the occupation is making a permit system. Permit system means that everything I want to do in my life, if I live in Area C, for example, building a restroom needs a permit. Traveling from one place to another needs a permit. Me to go outside Palestine, I need a permit. So the permit system doesn't allow me to go to Jerusalem. My dream is to visit Gaza. And I'm a Palestinian. I live in Hebron. It's only 40 minutes by car to reach Gaza. It's completely closed for me. It's not possible. Even one time, I am an engineer, and I had a project in Gaza to go to supervise it. I lost that supervision opportunity because the occupation didn't give me a permit. In the same way, the people who are living in Gaza, they don't go outside Gaza. The Gaza is sieged. Hebron is completely closed. West Bank is closed. West Bank, that is the life. It's built on restriction. Imagine that as someone studying in the university, that you have much more restrictions on movement, on opinion, on identity than the other students. Imagine that some students, they have more rights in the university, not based on how good they are in their studies, but it's based because they are white, or they are originally from that country, or because they are really, according to their religion. So this is what is happening in all over West Bank. Even the term apartheid is not enough. It's segregation and separation and restriction and the human rights violation. So it's all in one. In Hebron city, for example, certain streets are for the Jews and other streets are for the Muslims. Other streets are for those people and that people. And it's all divided, fragmented. Why? Because Israeli occupation is going on with their ethnic cleansing plans, that the Palestinians leave their land, leave their country, and as Jeff said, it's about Judaizing, West Bank, about making it, remove the Palestinian identity of West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, and even, the Palestinian identity doesn't exist at all. We as Palestinians, we are saying we want only equality. We want equality, we want freedom, we want justice and self-determination, which the international law gave it to us. It's not about that what we dream something outside the international law or the international, consensus. In the contrary, there is an international consensus against the Israeli occupation. There is an international consensus against the Israeli settlements. And now I see that there is a consensus that Israel is an apartheid state from the river to the sea.
Thank you. Thank you, Brother Issa. I mean, that very, very clearly and very eloquently you define the Rome Statutes that defines the crime of apartheid. I'll just read it so our listeners can understand what you're saying and how it can relate to how the Rome Statute and also the United Nations defines apartheid. They define it as an inhuman act committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systemic oppression and domination by one racial group over another racial group. And I think what we've heard from Issa very much sums up this or fits into this definition. And I think from that we can see why NGOs, world leaders, people who have lived under apartheid in South Africa all consider Israel as an apartheid state. Jeff, I would like to bring you back in here again. But before we talk about your One Nation movement, I would like to discuss the basic nation state law that was passed in 2018. And I think even those people who wavered about Israel not being an apartheid state, when Israel enacted this law in 2018, I think a lot of people then were very vocal and came out, and even Israelis themselves, some of them were warning the politicians that if you do pass this law, we will be very easily be called apartheid state. So can you just explain to us the nation state law that was passed in 2018, what it means and how it's being enacted?
Yeah, for a long time, Israel had to play this game that it was a European liberal democracy. That's why it gets so upset when you call it an apartheid state, and so on. But, in many ways, I think the Israeli government certainly feels that it's won. In other words, the idea of settler colonialism is not just to take over the country, but it's to normalize your takeover. So that over time, people begin to see that Israel is Israeli Jewish, South Africa is a white country with some black people around in the fringes somewhere. America is a white Christian country. That's the idea, is to normalize the settler domination. And Israel's tried very hard. That's where its programs of hasbara, of PR, become. It's very, very skilled at doing that. And Netanyahu is skilled at doing that. So it's played this game all the time of trying to cast the Palestinians as terrorists. And all we're doing is defending ourselves. And we're the peaceful, peace-loving country that's trying to just live in our country peacefully as if, we're in Sweden. And that's the narrative. But what happened is that I think Israel feels that it's won, that it's beaten the Palestinians, that the international community, especially the governments of the world, like the United States, like Britain, have accepted Israeli domination. They maybe critique the settlements here and there, but they've accepted the reality of the settlements. The occupation is really not even an issue anymore. You don't hear about it. We're having an election in 4 days. It's not even discussed as an election issue anymore. Occupation, Palestinians, peace. And that's true in the international community as well, where, they're supporting Israel, the governments. And so I think the Jewish nationalities law simply reflects the fact that Israel now feels confident enough in its control, in its squelching and marginalizing of the Palestinians, and in its normalizing of the idea that Israel is a Jewish country. And by Israel, it means the whole country to the Jordan River, that it can begin to enact in a very public way laws that are obviously not democratic and not liberal, like the Jewish nationalities law that you just mentioned, that says, yes, Jews are first-class citizens, and Palestinians in Israel are second-class citizens, and Palestinians in the occupied territories aren't even part of the equation at all. And like I said, it has to do with language and culture. It was largely symbolic, but not entirely, because the importance of it, in my view, is again this legal dimension. The fact that one of the big problems of the right wing in Israel is the legal system here, including the Supreme Court, that it gives a little bit of a liberal hue to the whole thing. The Supreme Court, that our professional lawyers and judges have to some degree take into account human rights, and that really bothers because obviously apartheid can't be reconciled with human rights. So what the Jewish nationalities law did was basically neutralize human rights as a consideration for judges, and it freed the judges to make their decisions based on simply Jewish or Israeli interests rather than on the legal interests that they had to before. And that's a very serious thing. That's where people like Issa now, formally have a redress to the courts. I mean, Issa can go to the Supreme Court, but he can never win because it's all been the whole thing is rigged against any kind of Palestinian trying to actually use the law in any sort of equal way.
Thanks. I mean, the nation state law, obviously, it allowed for preferential treatment to the Jewish community, not only to the citizenship itself, but to housing, settlement, land, language, and even culture. I mean, the fact that
marriage too. Marriage, Ismail too.
No longer recognize it. Brother Issa, has that also impacted and reverberated the treatment of the Palestinians across the region?
No, we in West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem, as Jeff said, we don't exist in the Israeli legal system as citizen. We are people out of any description for them. We are under the Israeli military law. Military law, you don't exist. You don't have identity even. They don't consider us Palestinian in Hebron or in Gaza or even in Jerusalem. You are someone who is a guest there till they have the right opportunity to transfer you. And now they are doing everything possible to make the environment in West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem not attractive for people to live. So we have many Palestinians, they leave their own country. So I say it loud all the time. Nakba of 1948 and the Aqsa of 1967, they didn't stop. It's till now continuous. They are making our life harder and harder. The unemployment rate in Palestine is more than 35%, and Gaza is more than 50 to 60%. That unemployment rate means anyone qualified to have a proper job, he or she leaves the country to go to somewhere else. And this is what they want. We call it brain drain. So that we are losing all the educated people, all the smart entrepreneur, or everybody who has any alternative overseas, they go and travel, they don't stay. So it's kind of the Israeli supremacy on us that they make our life harder and harder. Not only that, Oslo Accord, the peace accord, or what they call it, the peace accord, they signed the agreement to hide the crime of occupation and change it to a permanent control of the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian political life. So they are controlling everything in West Bank by using Oslo Accord, and even they don't, they don't implement everything on it. They take what suits them and they impose it on us. So they squeeze us economically, politically, and you are stuck in your own country. And I want to give many examples about how we don't exist as Palestinians. I can say that I was attacked physically by Israeli settlers. Someone come attack you. It happened to me 2010. I want to use this story. A settler came attacked me. He claimed that I attacked him. He has higher legal status than me. I was arrested, beaten, tortured, and after 10 years, I was convicted in the Israeli military court that I attacked him. Why? Because it's the Israeli legal system. It doesn't see my testimony valid against settler testimony, who's a Jewish white Israeli who has all the political and civilian and legal rights to stay in our own country, and we as Palestinians don't exist. Not only that, development. This is something very important. Economical development. Israel, as Sarah Roy, she's a Jewish Harvard scholar. She wrote a book, you can Google it, development. The development that Israeli occupation is working to remove any development opportunities for the Palestinians and make us dependent on the Israeli market. So we are not allowed to establish or create our own electricity. So we have to buy it from Israel. So we stay dependent on the Israeli electricity companies, and they sell it to us the electricity with higher money than the settlers pay in Hebron, for example. Not only that, solar and green energy. We as Palestinians, we are not allowed to have our own solar green energy systems in West Bank, and we need a special permit from the Israeli civil administration to establish any system in West Bank and even to enter any system to Gaza. Why? Because Israel wants to stay leading us. Leading is not the accurate word. The supremacy, to stay its supremacy on us, its control on us, to make us weak without any real pillar to have our own economy and our own civil society. Not only that, water. I'm talking about basic needs of the Palestinians. Water too. I didn't get the same amount of water the settlers get in Hebron, for example. The settler in Hebron gets 10 times water than me. Why? Why he needs more water than me? Why the settler gets for personal use? I'm not talking about for agriculture. We Palestinians, we don't get any water for agriculture in West Bank. Why? Because they want to take the land, so we don't plant our we don't use our land. We leave it poor without any development. So they take it and they declare it as a state land. Then they give it for free for the Israeli settlers and even supported. I know unfortunately, many countries decided to label the settlement goods. Amnesty International has its own campaign to ban settlement goods from going to Europe and to UK and to everywhere in the world. Unfortunately, do you see in UK any labeled settlement goods? No. Even there is a double standards of treatment in many countries with Israel. Israel is not only it's apartheid here. I see double standards even in implementing the international law. And Ismail, we saw how many countries refused that Israel to be investigated, not to be convicted by the International Criminal Court. They didn't want the International Criminal Court, the ICC, which is an international tool which was used in Africa many times. They don't want, Israel to be investigated. Maybe it's not, they don't do any war crimes in West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. So even in interrogation and investigation of the crime of apartheid and war crimes, the international community doesn't want. This is what we can do, that we work together to pressure the international community to make Israel accountable according to the international law and according to our principles and morals as people. Me, Issa, I can say that I am educated, I read, I write, I'm not equal to a settler who is not educated, who doesn't read and write. He lives in a welfare life with everything. And an example now, we are all suffering from COVID-19, Ismail. It's very hard, the situation all over the world. Many people lost their relatives. We are in lockdown. Israel is very proud that it's a green country now. We, the Palestinians, we didn't get the vaccine. My parents, my mother has a cancer and she's more than 70. My father is 78 and he didn't get a vaccine. But an Israeli Jew who's living in Tel Rumeina, few meters far from me, who's 16 years old, 20 years old, they got the vaccine. So where is the equality, even in treatment and medical needs? How Israel got all that vaccine and they didn't give it to us? And as you know, according to the international law, Geneva Convention, it says that Israel is responsible about our health because we are living under the Israeli occupation. So water is discriminated, electricity is discriminated and even controlled, and health, is completely discriminated and controlled. And not only that, even, ambulances, to reach from one point to another, they were stuck. Today, Israel killed a Palestinian. They shot him on the head because he was protesting a settlement in West Bank. This is how they treat us. They, even with the law, they shoot us, they kill us, and our life doesn't value to them. And me, I'm an example: attacked, beaten, arrested, detained, and many other Palestinians, women, children, activists. We are stuck with this occupation, not only of a crime of apartheid, but crime of everything wrong you can see and you can understand. You can't defend this occupation. You can't justify this occupation. You can't at all understand why they are doing all of that to us. Until now, we are living in that suffer and that situation of inhuman situation. It's really hard. I don't know how to describe my feeling as a Palestinian who's stateless, who has no rights, no basic human rights.
Thank you, Issa, for very that emotional experience. It's really heart rendering. Of course, you're talking about Atif Hamisha, who's been shot today earlier. But that brings us also very nicely to what Jeff was speaking about earlier, that Israel controls the total way of life, anything between the sea and the river, the Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea. So Jeff, I would like you to, the last few minutes we've got now, to maybe explore the impasse, not necessarily the impasse actually, I rephrase that, the apartheid that the Palestinians are experiencing. How do we overcome it? And what potential theoretical as well as practical moves do you think are possible within the society that Issa has so eloquently sort of shown to us, that the division is so great and the Palestinian suffering is so severe, that and you on the other side have also mentioned the superiority of the Israelis, the fact that they do not care anymore what the world society thinks because they believe the world society is on their side. So how do we overcome this?
Well, we have to have a political program. You can't be in a political struggle without an end game. We have to see ourselves as political actors. We're not just gadflies. We're not just critiquers. We're not just protesters, resistors. All that's important, of course, but we have to come with a political plan. And we, the people, and I mean the Palestinians, because our One Democratic State campaign is a Palestinian-led campaign, but certainly supported by critical Israelis, we're the only force that can do that within the community here. And in many ways, it's like South Africa. South Africa had the same issue with apartheid, and that was the dominant white society was not going to be active in dismantling apartheid. The government, the white government, was not going to be active in terms of dismantling apartheid. The international community of governments was not going to help dismantle apartheid. Thatcher and Reagan and all these people supported apartheid. So it was up to the ANC to come up with a political program, and their only allies were the international civil society. Ismail, you and I are of a certain age, so we remember the anti-apartheid struggle. We were all religious groups and trade unions and university groups and civic groups all over the world came together to really fight the apartheid regime and change their government's policies towards it. And in the end, it collapsed. And I think that's exactly what the Palestinians have to do. They have to go to their only allies that are the international civil society, the people of the world. I mean, Israel might have the governments behind it for all kinds of reasons of selling arms and all of that stuff. But they've lost the court of public opinion. That's why they get so uptight about anti-Semitism and BDS, and it's very shrill because they know that they're losing in the court of public opinion. So the people, I think, are behind the Palestinian cause. And so what we're trying to do is insert into that movement for Palestinians that exists in the world a political program. So we have something specific to advocate for. BDS is very important, but it's a tool. We have to be BDSing for something, for a political end game. And the end game that we're suggesting, we have a 10-point program. We have a website. It's called the onestatecampaign.org. And you can see our manifesto. It's a 10-point program that basically says we should have over all of historic Palestine, one constitutional democracy. One person, one vote, one parliament, one citizenship, equal rights for everyone. That's the basis. Of course, refugees not only have the right to return, the refugees, but we want them to return. They're our citizens. Just because you flee a country during a war or you get driven out of the country during a war doesn't mean you lose your citizenship, your civil status, and the refugees have to come home. And then we're envisioning, and this isn't easy for Palestinians to do, but we have to do this. We're envisioning decolonization, the dismantling of all the colonial structures of domination and control that Zionism has built and created over the Palestinians, dismantle all of that and create a new country, a new state, a new civil society, a new political economy that's inclusive of everyone. So I think that, it's not easy for Palestinians, and you can hear from Issa, imagine his life, that now he has to sort of think about a future in which it's inclusive of Israelis as well. It's not easy, but that's the problem, in most settler colonial situations. I mean, Algeria is an exception. The settlers have succeeded in establishing themselves so strongly that you're not going to eliminate them. You're not going to throw them out. I mean, they left France. The settlers did not leave the United States. They didn't leave South Africa. They didn't leave Australia. And I think this is a bitter pill the Palestinians have to accept, that the Israeli Jews are going to be here. And now we have to come together. And that's where, as a critical Israeli Jew, I'm an ally here in a Palestinian-led movement to say, let's have equal rights for everyone. And equal rights also means equal national rights. In other words, you can be a Palestinian national, you can be an Israeli national, but within the framework, in other words, you can have a certain national identity, ethnic identity, your religious identity is important and guaranteed in our program. We have a multicultural society, but within the framework, like the UK in a way, within the framework of a single democracy. That's the vision and that's the plan. And I think it's the only way out. It's the only way to end the settler colonial. That is decolonization, and it creates a new political community that then Palestinians can feel, that really belongs to them. The country begins to belong to everyone.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Very, very helpful. And your ideas, obviously, every individual will have to have certain points on it. And I appreciate your point. Issa, I would like to bring you back in as a last statement, really, as we're running out of time. But how do you see, under the present sort of draconian measures that the Palestinians are living in particularly the West Bank? Gaza is an open prison. East Jerusalem Palestinians are really heavily oppressed and subjugated. How do you see the impasse for the Palestinians? Do you see any hope? And where do you see that light to help the Palestinians?
I am very optimistic that the Israeli occupation, apartheid, segregation, and oppression will end soon. I am very optimistic because, as you see now, we have many students watching us, and those students, if they really act according to their morals and principles and think with us that we should all united to make a change and believe in themselves that they really can make a change, because we as Palestinians, we are not going to give up. We will continue struggling against Israeli occupation and apartheid till we get our full rights as Palestinians. But with the support of the international solidarity groups and international activists, especially the students, we can make a change. I'm very optimistic that we have someone as Jeff, someone as you, Ismail, and someone as Miko Beled and many other Americans, Europeans, who are really standing with the justice, standing with the oppressed people. This is how we can make a change. I think that we need to focus now on making the Israeli occupation suffer from the occupation. So to create plans and be creative, plans, actions, tactics, campaigns to increase awareness in our communities and to make the community act and do concrete actions, especially governments and politicians, concrete plans to make the occupation more expensive on the occupiers. When we have equal, let me say, power, we can sit together and have a real solution for the situation now. But we as Palestinians, we are defending now what is left because they want to take it over. The occupation they didn't stop, they want to take over. So we want the people who are now watching to be organized. You have many groups in the UK and in the world. You can be part, you can be member, you can support those organizations. So they have a lot of activities in Palestine. So I want to say that the end of the occupation, it's a matter of time, but let's speed it up and make it less of suffering of the Palestinians who are living in Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, and we should not forget our brothers and sisters who are refugees, especially in Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Syria, and all over the world. This is how we can make a change. Be united, be on the right side of the international law, and implement it 100% on Israel.
Thank you, Issa. I mean, I think what we have learned today is something very apparent to most of us who have been observing and tracking the situation on the ground in Palestine. Most of us have a high moral ground, and I think that is something that you should take home message with, that what you're trying to do is dismantle an apartheid system, and that is what we should aim for and focus upon, that the injustices that is being carried out by the state of Israel are unacceptable, and we want parity between every individual in that region. And I think that message, if it threatens somebody, then be it. But as individuals who are acting and working towards that, I think should be able to hold up their heads high and be bold enough and eloquent enough to be able to articulate that in any circle that you are in. So the very simple message, as Issa and Jeff both have alluded to, that Israel has total control in every way an aspect of a life of a Palestinian, whether it be in 1947 area, whether it be in post-67, which is Gaza and West Bank, or East Jerusalem, and of course, even denying the refugees the right to return. So they have total control. And it is that control, the supremacy of one group of people over the other, and that is so unjustly being exercised, is what we have to challenge. And I hope with those messages, you can take this home with you and work towards making a wider and a greater civil society who can bring about a change for not only the Palestinians, but if our governments also act morally and ethically, then our foreign policy will also have acquired a higher moral ground and something that we all be proud of. So Jeff and Issa, thank you very much for joining us, and all of you participants who have joined us together today, thank you very much. And I hope that this has been beneficial to you as it has been to me. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.